So many of you know that I help a lot of newer lawyers. And in fact, I had a couple of lawyers that had a TBI case they thought a TBI case. And they came into my office this morning and they told me about how they've been negotiating. I want to talk about what they were doing. No disrespect to them. They've acknowledged that they made some strategic mistakes. And there's a way of negotiating involving policy demands and 998s that would have radically changed this case. So let me start by telling you a 250 policy with a serious accident, but some questions about the amount of damage, whether there is a longstanding TBI or not. And pre-lit, the plaintiff's lawyers made a policy limits demand, not knowing what the policy was. It was 250 under the new CCP 999. And what that says is you got to give them a certain amount of time, 33 days. You provide all this information. And that is what would be appropriate and required to potentially open the policy. Ultimately, the carrier pre-lit offered on a 250 policy $30,000. So they file and serve. And then when they go into litigation, they made a $4.9 million demand. Fast forward a year later, they come to see me. And my first question is, well, when did you make the 998 for the 250? Oh, we didn't. We made it to straight up to 4.9. And I said, well, your case is worth what? And they've now come to the conclusion that's probably worth 2 to 250. So my question is, well, what are you going to do now? Well, we'll make a 250 demand now. I said, yes, but you're going to lose all credibility because you went so high on a number that you weren't prepared to do. And I say that this happens all the time, right? You have a case that you'd settle for $1 to $2 million. You got a lot of coverage. And so newer lawyers say, well, let's make a $12 million demand. I said, well, is 2 million a good number? Yes. Well, why would we make a $12 million demand? For me to get from 12 to 2, I have to drop millions and millions of dollars compared to the carrier that only has to go up, substantially less than that. And I'm going to look like a fool. So I'm not going to demand 10 or $12 million on a case that's worth 2. Maybe I'm going to demand 4.5, 6, 7. As an aside, you always want to use non-round numbers. If I'm going to make a $4.5 million demand, I might make a $4.55 million demand or a $4.48 million demand. But now let's go back to our case. If instead of pre-lit general policy demand, file $4.9 million demand. That's now a year later, and now there's a trial date that's probably going to be another year and a half. Instead of the first filed demand being 4.9, why not make a policy limits 250,998? You made it pre-lit, and they weren't going to pay it. In fact, they offered 40. So there's really no chance that they're going to take the 250,998. Right? And you would have at least a year of interest running. You would have at least more leverage since there's no trial date, that if in fact the case turned out to be more valuable and you tried it, by the time you went to trial, you would have 2.5, 3 years of interest. Cost the whole time. Instead, by going too high, too quick, without an intervening 998, when you go from 4.9 and now you make a 250 or less 998, the first thing the carrier is going to say is, they've lost all interest in this case, et cetera, and they probably are going to continue to lowball them. So in both situations, pre-lit policy demand, generally, a much higher demand, and a 998. If they had done the pre-lit demand for the policy and then a 998 for the policy, and when that is not accepted, then go above the policy, it's a completely different negotiation, a completely different case. It gives so much more flexibility to the plaintiff's lawyers, and you got interest and costs running the whole time. If you have any other questions, if you're thinking about how do I negotiate, it is much more complicated than go as high as I can, as quickly as I can, for as long as I can. It is much more complicated. It involves a number of factors. I'm happy to help in any way. Just reach out. My info's in the bio or the video description.